Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're tackling relativism today and going deep like a philosopher might.
Relativism, right, it can really make you think. The big question is, are truth, values, knowledge, even reality itself absolute? Or do they depend on something else, like culture or language, maybe even individual perspective?
Whoa, okay. My brain's already in overdrive. Can we break this down a bit?
Yeah.
What's it actually mean for something to be relative? Give me a real-world example that would resonate with, like, a philosopher deep in thought.
All right. Imagine a philosophy conference and someone says, stealing is wrong. Our relativist would probably ask, wrong according to who, based on what?
Hmm. They're making us think about the framework behind the judgment.
Oh, I see. So instead of just accepting stealing is wrong as some universal truth, we have to think about the context. Like, is it always wrong no matter what? Or does it depend on the situation, the culture, the act itself? Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. Relativists say a lot of what we might think are absolute truths actually depend on or co-vary with other factors. It's like there's a hidden according to tucked into these statements.
Okay, covary hidden according to I'm following. But can you unpack that a bit more, for our listeners who might not be philosophy experts?
Sure, it's like a recipe. The final product, the truth or value of a statement, depends on the ingredients. Those ingredients could be the culture you were raised in, the language you speak, or even your own personal experiences and values. Change the ingredients, and you change the final product.
So stealing is wrong might be true in one culture, but not in another with different cultural ingredients.
Precisely. That's what's challenging and so exciting about relativism. It forces us to think differently about the very basis of knowledge, of morality, of how we see the world.
My head's already spinning, and we haven't even gotten to the different types of relativism. There's cultural conceptual truth relativism, a whole bunch. But before we get into that, why would anyone think relativism is true? It sounds a little chaotic, right?
I get that. It can seem like anything goes morality or that there's no truth. But the arguments in favor of relativism usually start with a simple fact. Throughout history and across cultures, people have had a huge variety of beliefs, values, and ways of life.
Oh, absolutely. Just
Yeah.
think about how differently ancient civilizations saw the universe compared to what we know from science today. Or how arranged marriage is normal in some cultures and totally unacceptable in others.
Exactly. And for a relativist, this diversity isn't just a quirky fact of history. It shows that there might not be just one right way to see the world. They'd say what we think of as true is often connected to our culture, our language, our individual perspective.
So are you saying believing in, say, witchcraft could be true for one culture but not for a scientist? Wouldn't that mean we have to accept any belief, even dangerous ones?
That's a key point. And it brings up a huge debate about relativism. How do we respect different viewpoints while still holding on to things we see as crucial, like human rights or rejecting violence?
Yeah, that's what I'm struggling with. If everything is relative, how can we say anything is truly wrong, like oppression or injustice? It feels like you could justify anything.
That's a common concern, and we'll talk about the arguments against relativism later. But for now, let's stick with the reasons why people support it. Even if you don't agree with the relativist view, understanding their perspective can help you think more critically about your own.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have cultural diversity as a point for relativism. What else?
Well, there's the simple fact that people disagree. Think about all the debates that have gone on forever in philosophy, ethics, even science. If
Yeah.
there were absolute, objective truths in these areas, wouldn't everyone agree eventually?
That's a good point. Like, if there's one real answer to the meaning of life, wouldn't someone have figured it out by now?
Right. Relativists would argue that these constant disagreements, the lack of universal agreement, suggests that maybe there isn't one right answer. Maybe truth, at least sometimes, depends on your perspective or framework.
So maybe everyone's got a piece of the truth relative to their own little bubble.
You got it. But of course, this raises another issue. If everyone's truth is so different, how can we even talk to each other or understand each other? That's something relativists need to address.
Okay, I'm seeing how relativism could be appealing, but there's some problems too. It's a tough one. Before we get too lost in this, let's get into the different types of relativism, starting with.
Actually, before we move on to the varieties, there's one more way to define relativism I should mention. It's more technical, but important. It's called the hidden parameter definition.
Hidden parameters. Sounds complicated. Tell me more.
Okay, imagine you're back at that philosophy conference and someone says, this new ethical theory is totally justified. Someone using the hidden parameter idea might ask, justified by what standard? What framework are we using? The idea is that claims about truth, knowledge, or justification often depend on a specific parameter or domain that isn't always stated directly. It's like a secret relative to hanging out in the background.
So instead of saying this theory is justified, they'd have to be more specific, like it's justified according to utilitarianism.
Exactly. And for relativists, this hidden parameter isn't just about being precise with language, it's a fundamental idea about truth itself. They argue that these parameters, these frameworks for judgment, are built into the very way we think.
Wow. So truth or justification isn't just a standalone thing. It's always connected to a system of understanding.
Exactly. And now we can get to the exciting part, exploring the different types of relativism. Each one focuses on a different aspect of how truth, knowledge, and value can be relative. Ready to jump in?
Let's go. I'm all set for some serious brain work.
So let's dig into some of these different relativisms. We've touched on cultural relativism, but let's really unpack it.
Yes, please. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how a belief in, say, witchcraft can be true for one culture but not for a scientist. It's like saying every belief is equally valid, even if it contradicts what we know about the world today.
Yeah, that's a common misunderstanding about cultural relativism. It's not about saying all beliefs are equally true in some objective way or that we should just stop thinking critically. It's more about recognizing that what a culture considers true, especially when it comes to values, norms, and how they see reality, is tied to their history and social context.
So, like for the Izandu people we talked about, witchcraft isn't just some random superstition. It's a whole system of beliefs that helps them understand the world, their relationships, their place in everything.
Right. Cultural relativism encourages us to approach these systems with humility and respect. It helps us see that our own Western scientific worldview is just one of many. It's like, you wouldn't judge a jazz song by the standards of classical music, would you? Each has its own logic and beauty.
Okay, I'm getting that.
Yeah.
But doesn't this get tricky? If we can't judge other cultures, do we have to tolerate everything? Even things that seem harmful or wrong? What about a culture that believes in human sacrifice?
That's the big question. And it's one philosophers have been debating for a long time. The difference is between understanding and accepting. Cultural relativism asks us to understand why a culture believes what it does, to see things from their point of view. It doesn't mean we have to accept or condone those beliefs.
So it's like saying, I get why you believe this, given your history and worldview, but I might not agree with it personally.
Exactly. It's about empathy and open-mindedness, even when beliefs challenge our values. Of course, this doesn't mean we give up all moral judgment or tolerate things like human rights violations. There are limits to tolerance. Finding that balance is a big challenge for cultural relativism.
I see. It's about understanding, not necessarily endorsing. Thinking about cultures, it makes me wonder about how language might shape how we see reality. If cultures not only have different beliefs but different ways of talking about them, does that affect how they see the world?
That's an interesting point. You're touching on linguistic relativity, sometimes called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The idea is that the language we speak influences how we think and what we perceive.
So if I spoke a language that had a totally different way of thinking about time than English, would I actually experience time differently?
That's the strong version of the hypothesis, and it's debatable. There's evidence that language can affect our thinking, but how much it does is still being discussed. It's like language might not determine our thoughts completely, but it can give us the tools, the framework we use to understand the world.
So it's not that I experience time differently, but how I think about it, the categories I use are shaped by my language.
Exactly. And this ties into another type of relativism, conceptual relativism. This goes beyond cultural differences to how we categorize and understand the world using different frameworks.
So instead of just different cultures having different beliefs, it's like there are many valid ways of seeing the world, each with its own concepts and categories.
Precisely. Imagine trying to define what is art. What's a masterpiece in one culture might be nonsense in another. And there's no one right answer. Conceptual relativism says our understanding of the world comes through these frameworks, these conceptual schemes.
So it's like there are multiple versions of the world, each seen through different lenses.
That's a good way to put it. Philosophers like Nelson Goodman, who supported conceptual relativism, said that world-making is creative. We don't just passively observe reality, we actively build it with our concepts and categories. And there are many valid worlds we can build.
But wait, if there are many worlds, doesn't that mean reality itself is relative? Are we living in the Matrix?
Well, it's a thought-provoking concept. Conceptual relativism makes us question what objectivity and reality even are. It's not denying there's a world out there, but saying how we access that world is always filtered through our ways of thinking. It's like wearing different colored glasses. Each pair shows you a different view of the same thing.
So how do we know which world version is right? Or is that even a question we can ask?
That's the challenge for conceptual relativists. They'd say there's no view from nowhere, no way to judge which conceptual scheme is correct. Each one works within its own framework.
This is some mind-bending stuff. But we're on a roll. Let's move on to truth relativism.
All right. Truth relativism gets to the heart of what true even means. A truth relativist argues that truth isn't just a simple property of statements, it's relative to a framework, perspective, or context.
Wait, are you saying something can be true for me but false for you? How does that work?
Let's say you're at an art gallery with a friend and you say, "That painting is beautiful." Your friend might say, "That's awful." A truth relativist could say both statements are true, even though they contradict each other. The truth depends on the person's aesthetic judgment.
So, truth is subjective, just a personal opinion. If that's the case, can we even have real disagreements or debates?
It's not always about individual opinions. Truth relativism can also apply to cultural or conceptual frameworks. A statement about reality might be true in one scientific theory but false in another.
So truth is like a moving target, always changing.
You could say that. And it does make us wonder about objective truth and how we can have rational discussions if truth is always relative. But remember, truth relativism is just one type of relativism, and not all relativists agree with such a strong view of truth.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture, but my brain needs a break. We still have epistemic relativism and moral relativism to talk about, and those are big topics.
They are. But it's important to remember that while these different relativisms seem separate, they're connected. They all challenge us to rethink our ideas about knowledge, truth, and value, and they show how important perspective, context, and interpretation are.
Got it. I'm ready for the next round. Let's talk about epistemic relativism. Okay, so after that deep dive into cultural, linguistic, and conceptual relativism, my brain is doing flips. But we've still got those two big ones left: epistemic relativism and moral relativism. Let's start with epistemic relativism. What's that all about?
Well, epistemic relativism looks at knowledge and justification. It challenges the idea that there's one objective standard for what counts as knowledge or a justified belief. Instead, it says those standards can vary depending on the system or framework you're working with.
Wait, so what I think is knowledge could be different from what you think is knowledge. Wouldn't that mean we can't even agree on what it means to know something?
That's the core question, yeah. Imagine scientists, indigenous elders, and philosophers all having a discussion. Each group might have different ways of knowing, different standards of evidence, different ways of backing up their beliefs.
Could you give an example? Like, how would their ways of knowing actually be different?
Sure. For the scientists, empirical evidence like experiments and data would be the most important thing for knowledge. For the indigenous elders, knowledge might come from generations of experience passed down through stories and traditions, and the philosophers would rely on logic and reasoning to justify their beliefs. Epistemic relativism would say that none of these ways of knowing is automatically better than the others, they're just different approaches.
So it's like saying there are many paths up the knowledge mountain, each with its own challenges. But wouldn't that lead to chaos? If there's no objective standard, how can we be sure we're making any real progress in understanding things?
That's a fair point. Epistemic relativism does make us think about objective knowledge and how to evaluate different systems of knowing. But it's not saying that anything goes, it's more about acknowledging that knowledge is more complicated than we might think at first.
So instead of looking for one big truth, we should explore all the different ways people know things, recognizing that different cultures might have valuable insights.
Right. Epistemic relativism encourages us to broaden our thinking, to be open to different ways of knowing, and to have respectful conversations even when people see things differently. We might even learn something new in the process.
Okay, I can see how having a more diverse view of knowledge could be beneficial. But now let's get to the really controversial one: moral relativism. That's the one that gets everyone riled up.
Definitely. Moral relativism is a hot topic. It tackles the big questions of right and wrong, good and evil, and challenges the idea that there are universal moral rules that apply to everyone.
So you're saying there's no such thing as objective morality, that it all depends on opinion or culture. Doesn't that mean anything goes and we can't condemn things that seem obviously wrong, like murder?
That's a common concern, and moral relativists need to address it. They'd argue that even without absolute moral rules, we can still have discussions about morality, make judgments about actions, and hold people accountable.
But how can we do that without some kind of objective standard? How do you reason about morality if everything is relative?
One way is to look at the consequences of actions instead of abstract principles. Even if there's no universal right or wrong, we can still see if an action leads to well-being, reduces suffering, or helps create a just society.
So instead of saying stealing is wrong because of some rule, we'd say it's wrong because it hurts someone and breaks down trust.
Exactly. It's a more practical approach that considers the situation. What's right in one case might be wrong in another.
That makes me think of the trolley problem, where you have to decide whether to let one person die to save five others. There's no easy answer, and people have different gut feelings about what's right.
That's a great example. It shows how moral relativism can help us see how complicated ethical problems are. It reminds us that our moral judgments are shaped by our values, our culture, our experiences, even our emotions.
Well, we've explored a lot today, from cultural relativism to moral relativism. My mind is full. Any way to sum it all up? Is there a common thread that runs through all these different kinds of relativism?
It's interesting, right? Even with their differences, all forms of relativism share a distrust of absolutes. They question the idea that there are universal truths or values that apply to everyone, no matter what.
So it's not just about saying everything is relative. It's about understanding how perspective, context, and interpretation shape our knowledge, values, and even what we think of as truth.
Exactly. Relativism, in all its forms, pushes us to challenge what we think we know, to be more aware of our own biases, and to be open to different ways of thinking and experiencing the world.
But that doesn't mean we give up on the idea of objectivity or truth.
Right. Relativism isn't about saying anything goes. It's about understanding that truth, knowledge, and morality are more complicated than we might think.
So maybe relativism is a way to have deeper, more thoughtful conversations about the big questions, knowing that there might not be one right answer.
I think so. It's about acknowledging the messiness of human experience and seeing how different perspectives can be valuable.
I started out a bit skeptical about relativism, but after exploring all this, I'm seeing how interesting it can be. It's a thought-provoking way to see the world.
I'm glad to hear that. You don't have to become a full-blown relativist to appreciate these ideas. Even if you don't completely agree with relativism, thinking about these arguments can help you refine your own thinking and understand things in a more nuanced way.
Well said. And for those who want to go even deeper into this, I recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy's entry on relativism. It's a great resource for all the different viewpoints.
Absolutely. It's a great place to start for anyone who wants to explore these ideas further. Remember, philosophy is all about asking questions, challenging what we think we know, and expanding our understanding of ourselves and the world.
On that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into relativism. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.